Hello guys, my name is Mortaza, and in this video, I'm gonna be talking about the differences between PPR, partial pre-rendering, and suspense in Next.js. So as you can see, I have a default Next.js project here, and if I go here, I'm just gonna delete all of these um, elements that are in the home page, and I'm just gonna say hello world. Okay, let's see that. Okay. I just want to show you how suspense works in Next.js and then move on to PPR stuff. And for that, I am going to create a component called slow component. Oops, slow component that takes time to render. And it's a server component. Okay, so for simulating the waiting, I am going to use promises for that. So I'm going to create another new promise, which resolves after 3 seconds, and it resolves with slow component as a text. And I'm going to show that here in the div. Value dot then, come on, then value returns value. Okay, so if we look at this, actually let's grab this slow component and put it here in our page so that we can see what's happening. Okay, it takes 3 seconds to render. Yeah. But if I open up a new page, open up a new tab with the same URL with our project, you see that there is no loading spinner that we can show to the user, which indicates that something is loading. So I want to show that hello world hard-coded here. So it's static content, it doesn't change, and put that slow component in a suspense boundary with the fallback of whatever a spinner or just a div that says loading. And if you look at this, okay, it shows a loading indicator that we're loading something from the server. And for you to understand this better, that how suspense works, I am going to draw something for you, draw visually, so that you can understand it better. We have our client here, and also we have a server here. So this is how suspense works in Next.js. Make this bigger. Come on. Okay. So client sends a request to the server and says, hello, send me the static shell. Well, what is a static shell? Well, in our example, the static shell is hello world because this is static. It doesn't change. It's hard-coded basically. And the server sends the static shell to the client. This is static shell. Okay. And also, server sends additional requests as chunks that we stored in suspense or whatever we stored in the suspense boundary. So server's gonna send responses with whatever stored in suspense. So in our example, it's the slow component. Basically, server sends the static shell with the hello world to the client and then streams the slow component to the client. So that's how suspense works in Next.js. What about PPR? PPR in Next.js. It's a bit complex than how suspense works right now. And PPR also works with suspense. But we have our client here So it's a bit different than Suspense. We have our client, we have an edge server, and think of edge server as something close to the user so that client and server can talk quickly. And also we have a CDN here, CDN, and we have our actual server here. Okay, so I forgot to mention something here in Suspense. Well, if you look at that, you see that whenever client sends a request to the server, server takes time to spin up, to wake up. So client have to wait for server to wake up, and then server sends the static shell to the client. Why don't we store this static shell in a CDN so that it can be delivered quickly to the client? So client sends a request to the edge and says, send me static shell. Static shell. And edge sends request to the CDN. Let me just right here. Okay. Edge sends a request to the CDN, and CDN sends the static shell to the client. Oops, what is this? Okay, let me draw another one. Okay. And also, at the time of when Edge sends a request to the CDN, it also sends a request to the server to make server spin up. So at the time that CDN sends the static shell to the client, we can spin up the server and user doesn't have to wait for server to spin up, okay? And server sends the additional responses with the chunks or whatever stored in Suspense. Okay, so that's how PPR works in a nutshell. And for the last point that I'm going to mention is that whenever we use Suspense, right now in Next.js 14, our component becomes dynamic. Well, in case if you don't know what a dynamic component is, well, we have two types of components in Next.js, static components and dynamic components. Static components are built at the build time, so when you run npm run build, Next.js builds them at the build time because they are static. But for dynamic components, Next.js builds them on demand on the request time at the server and then sends it to the client. So whenever we use Suspense in Next.js, our component becomes a dynamic component. In that case, in our example, the home page that we see here is becoming a dynamic component. Okay? You can think of PPR as a mix of statically rendered components and dynamically rendered components. So some parts of our page gets built at the build time, and we store that static shell in CDN, and another parts of our page gets rendered on the server at the request time. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.